Hello and welcome to WTFGAS Episode 9, where I will be looking at and tier ranking my childhood collection of Sega Saturn games. I feel like I should probably give you a bit of background about my gaming history. So, my first game console ever was Sega Genesis, and I got it when I was around 7 years old. I became an avid Sega fan, and even though I also had a Super Nintendo, most of the games I had as a kid were Sega. Genesis was my primary console, but I also had Sega CD, I had 32X. I even had the Power Base, which I stupidly sold at the yard sale. And for those of you who don't know, that is an adapter that allows you to play Master System games. And I also got some of those Master System games and also some Sega CD games from my uncle, who was also an avid gamer and was into Sega at the time. It helps when you have an uncle who's only 10 years older. So rather than all uncles who are all a full generation older. At any rate, um, I was incredibly lucky as a kid, especially in the 16-bit era, to really get to play most of the things that were good. I even got to play Mortal Kombat and Doom and all those things before I was 10, which is pretty awesome. I mean, for Christmas in '94, I got a 32X with Doom and Mortal Kombat 2, which, so far as I'm concerned, was to this day the best Christmas I've ever had in terms of gifts. And I know people like to mock the Doom 32X port, but at the time I thought that was the embodiment of excellence. The next Christmas I got my Sega Saturn, and I knew by this time, because I had subscriptions to GamePro and Next Generation, that Sega was behind Sony's PlayStation. That being said, I had full faith and confidence in Sega because I was a 9-year-old fanboy. And I thought, surely Sega won't let me down. Um, Virtua Fighter 2 is the most technologically advanced fighter on the market. It looks really good. And clearly Saturn is more powerful. Sega will pull it out. They'll have the coolest stuff. Everything will be fine. As we all know, that did not turn out to be the case. Shockingly, my 9-year-old self was not the wisest person when it came to predicting the fate of the console wars. And I know that comes as a shock to all of you. Anyway, over the years, I have retained a lot of interest in the Sega Saturn. I think that it actually is an underrated console. It still holds a place in my heart, even if it's not as big as, say, Genesis or even Super Nintendo. Or, hell, PlayStation, which I eventually went to around 97 or 98. But the Saturn still has a lot of fine games, and a lot of the best games were things I never got to experience because I didn't know about them. So over the years, I've actually collected a lot more Saturn games, or not a lot more, but I've maybe doubled the list you see here. So if you were to look through my collection now, you'd see about double this number of games. So just last week, I picked up Last Bronx, which is pretty much the last major Sega fighting game on the Saturn. And it is a weapons-based combat game, so it's kind of the Soul Edge for Saturn. Pretty good game, but not Soul Edge. And I also have acquired things like Mortal Kombat 2, which was one of my childhood favorite games. I always assumed the Saturn port would be the definitive version because the Saturn was such a 2D beast, but actually MK2 kind of sucks on Saturn. I also got the Doom port, which I had been warned about, but still it was stunning how bad it was. The draw distances are horrific, and it's, again, horrifying. Some other things I've discovered are things like Dragon Force and Shining Force 3, which were games I wasn't really into back then when I was a kid, but if I were playing these things now, that would be what I'd really want to play. And unfortunately, I found one of the particular quirks of my system is that even when you have the battery in it, it won't actually save games on the hard drive. So I really need to either get a different Saturn console or just simply emulate, so that way I can experience Dragon Force and Dragon Force 2 and all that. And I've also played Guardian Heroes, but I played that on Xbox. So, let's talk about the games I was playing between Christmas of '95 and approximately Christmas of '97 or the summer of '98, because that's about when the time when I got a PlayStation. For whatever reason, too, even though PlayStation was something I had a lot of fun with, my memories of getting it are pretty foggy. I know I had it in 7th grade, though. But with Saturn, we had just moved into a new house, and I remember playing it in the living room with the first 3 games I had, actually. And outside of those 3 games, the rest of these are kind of randomly assorted. But the first 3 games I had on Christmas morning in 1995 were Robotica, NBA Jam TE, and Panzer Dragoon 2's Wii. I've also played the original Panzer Dragoon, but only actually this year, as the remastered version for Xbox. Anyway, Robotica is a kind of generic sci-fi shooter, which is not so much a Doom clone as an Alien Trilogy clone. And Alien Trilogy, also a game I've picked up over the years, that's a little better than Robotica, but only because it has a bit more pizzazz. Robotica, the problem with it is that it doesn't really have a ton of personality. The mechanics are okay, but where it kind of falls apart is that the level design is deeply uninspired. Graphically, it looks pretty decent for the time, but again, it's kind of dark and repetitive. I really did not gain all that much enjoyment from it, but it was something that kind of opened my eyes to the difference between a 5th generation and a 4th generation console when it came to what was possible. So for me, Robotica is effectively a tech demo, or at least that's how I experienced it. But when I was trying to get my first-person shooter fix, that had really been an appetite that I had that had really been fueled by 32X Doom, I found that Robotica really wasn't a good substitute, and I found myself going back to the 32X I had in the basement. So, anyway, Robotica for me is about a D. It's not offensively bad, but it wasn't something that I was really able to get into despite many efforts to really find some value in the game. A lot of times my parents would try to balance out what they would get for me and my 2 sisters in terms of how much money they spent, and sometimes that would mean they would pick up discount games to make up for uh, value. And so they found NBA Jam Tournament Edition, which was fairly cheap, and gave me that. It wasn't something that I had requested, but it ended up being a decent enough game. It was something I already had on 32X by this time, and at some point I think I also might have picked up the original NBA Jam on Genesis, probably around the same time. I think I got all these games at just about the same moment, because this was around the same time that a lot of the old Genesis games were going on sale. So with NBA Jam TE, the Saturn version, the main problem with it is that the games run a little long. So usually you want the games to be short and sweet. So today my favorite version is actually the 32X version, which is just more or less an updated and improved version of the Genesis or Super Nintendo uh, experience. Saturn at the time, though, I really enjoyed. Because, again, I was a kid, so I didn't have that much going on, so the longer game time for NBA Jam was not a problem. Today, if I was going to play something that long, I'd expect a little bit more out of the experience, but when I was 9 or so, this was totally fine. That being said, it's not fundamentally different than the NBA Jam TE experience you could get even on Genesis or Super Nintendo, and there's really nothing particularly special about it. So for me, NBA Jam Tournament Edition is a C. I had a decent enough time with it, but it's not something I go back to these days. Next up, we have the game I was really excited about for Christmas, and that was Panzer Dragoon 2 Zui. And by the way, I don't remember how I got Robotica exactly for Christmas. I don't think I asked for it, but it might have been another one that was either on sale or that my dad thought looked cool. Anyway, so Panzer Dragoon, of course, the original was a big hit, and the sequel is also pretty well regarded. But the premise of the whole thing is that you ride on a kind of dragon, and you use your gun to shoot at targets that go by you while you're on rails. Most of your enemies look like sort of flying ghost ships. It's got a cool aesthetic, and it's also kind of this arid world that it's set in, and there's some cutscenes, but they're in Japanese, so I have no idea what they're talking about really, and I didn't pay that much attention to the cutscenes, especially as a kid. But anyway, just the aesthetic and the pacing and everything else, it really captured my imagination at the time. Especially after the first little bit where you're then gliding off of this mountainous area you were in, and then gliding down to this lower area where there's a valley. So there's just this long period where you're taking in this vista. And for the time, the graphics were stunning. Just this feeling of having this really intricate landscape. It wasn't something I'd ever experienced before. And the game itself was a lot of fun. Now, I've never been very good at it. I haven't gotten all that far, but I always had a good time doing it. And when I would have friends over who didn't know what the Saturn was, and spoiler, that was all my friends that I ever had as a kid, no one else ever had a Saturn. In fact, to this day, I don't think I've met anyone else in person who I've been closely associated with who ever had a Saturn. So, anytime I try to introduce somebody to Saturn, this is really the game that I pull out. Because for me, this represents the potential of Saturn. I guess for most people, it would probably be something like Nights into Dreams, which has a very unique look and feel. But for me, the thing that was most Saturn would be Panzer Dragoon 2. Now, again, it's a short, very difficult game. I never got that far into it, however, but because it was so cool, and it frankly is a skill issue, I will have to put Panzer Dragoon 2 in the A category. And this is something that I really hope, I'm really looking forward to the remaster that I presume will come out sometime either later this year or early next year. It's been delayed a bit because of COVID, but it should be out at some point in the near future. Next up is the first major fighting game that I experienced on the Sega Saturn, and that was Fighting Vipers. Now, the game I was really excited about was Virtua Fighter 2. I had the original Virtua Fighter on 32X. It was a decent enough 3D fighter, and in all the gaming magazines I'd read all about Virtua Fighter 2 and how it was really the pinnacle of fighting games up to that point. And this was at a period in my life where I thought fighting games were my favorite genre. I hadn't figured out yet that I really don't have the hand-eye coordination to put together combos. And over the course of my time as a Saturn gamer, I would kind of slowly figure that out and start to move on to other genres. But at this time, I still thought of myself first and foremost as someone who was a connoisseur of fighting games. Fighting Vipers was not quite as visually stunning as Virtua Fighter 2, but it was a little faster, and it has this kind of fun, over-the-top 80s action feel to it. So it was always a good time. And I also liked the cages that you would fight in and the armor that your characters wore. So I always tried my best to knock the armor off my opponents and not just beat them in a vanilla fashion. Fighting Vipers is a fine game. And it's one of those that I felt like it would hold me over until I got something better, but in fact, I actually enjoy this one more than Virtua Fighter 2 or really any other fighting game on the platform. And in the years since, I found on Xbox Live the arcade version of Fighting Vipers. And I also got to experience, at least briefly, Fighting Vipers 2 on Dreamcast. I have to say the Saturn Fighting Vipers to me is by far the most fun version of this game. And it's not that close. For me, Fighting Vipers is another A. Very good game. Perhaps not a must-play, but certainly something that is a hell of a lot of fun. Next up, we have Independence Day. And this came out in relation to the movie in the summer of 1996. Now, I was a huge fan of that movie. It was, at the time, probably my favorite movie for a year or so, because it combined a couple of things I was interested in, military aviation and aliens. And so, obviously, I got the game. The game is kind of notorious for being a bit mediocre. That being said, I still had a good time playing it and unlocking the hidden aircraft and all that. It took me a long time to eventually beat it. I had to find some codes and cheats to beat the game, but I did beat it. It does have some awkward things going for it. It's very arcadey. You can actually bounce off the ground, provided that you have sufficient health. And I guess that might be a good feature just because you're always flying at a low altitude. Anyway, it is perhaps not the best game. It's not something that I would even recommend, but I actually had a pretty good time playing it, and so I'm going to actually put it in the B tier. As far as licensed games go, it's really not that terrible. Next up, we have Mortal Kombat Trilogy. So, effectively, with Mortal Kombat, once they made Mortal Kombat 3, they figured out that they had taken out too many core characters, especially Scorpion, and so they made Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 to add back in the characters people really wanted to play as. And then they took that same engine and added even more characters, including some boss characters, and called it Mortal Kombat Trilogy. So really, it should be called Super Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, because that's what it is. So, with Trilogy, it released on Saturn, N64, and PlayStation, and by all accounts, this is the weakest version that was released because there are some things that are missing, some little sound effects or what have you. That being said, those are very minor omissions, and the game itself is fundamentally fine. For a very long time, this was the best way that I had access to play 2D Mortal Kombat. Load times in this one are pretty modest, unlike MK2 for some reason. And it's a fine game. I give it a B. By the time that I got it, which I don't remember exactly when I received this game, my interest in MK was starting to fade a little bit, but still I did put in the time to try to master this one, and I never did. I'm pretty sure I never beat this game, but I still had a pretty good time playing it, and yeah. Really, the MK Trilogy is the last Mortal Kombat game that I've spent more than an hour playing, I would say. I think it was around the Christmas season of 1996. I know I was still living in Alaska, and we were living at the time on an Air Force base. And so we went into the, I guess it would be called BX on an Air Force base, which is kind of the store that's, I guess, the equivalent of like a Walmart, but for military personnel and their family. And I was looking at games, and Virtua Fighter 2, which I still hadn't gotten, was about $55 or $60, which was the full price of a game back then. $54.99 or $59.99, I can't remember. And the clerk happened to notice that I was looking at these games, and he asked me when I got my Saturn. And it turned out that there was a special promotion where if you already had a Saturn, you could get some older hits for free as a way to reward loyal customers. And the 3 games included happened to be 3 I didn't have: Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter 2, and Virtua Cop. So I picked those up in those little not-for-resale cases that you see there, and that's the reason I put them in cases rather than as blank, as just plain CDs, is because that's how I received them, and that was a unique experience because I had no idea I was about to receive such a windfall. Really, that's probably the best windfall I've ever gotten just going into a store. So in terms of free shit I've gotten in my life, this is definitely first and foremost in terms of something that really stunned me. And it was actually, I was so stunned by getting these things for free that I almost wasn't even excited because I was just so in disbelief that something like this had just fallen into my lap in such a literal way. Anyway, I'm not a racing game fan, and I never have been. Actually, the only racing game I've ever truly liked is probably Top Gear, the first one for Super Nintendo. But Daytona USA, of course I didn't give a shit that it wasn't to my liking because I had 2 other games that I really played the crap out of. Daytona USA, I don't really like it. From what I understand, Sega Rally was really where it was at when it came to Saturn racing, and you really needed the wheel and other things to really get the full experience. I've not put in a ton of time with Daytona USA. I'll give it a D. I'm sure it's fine. But again, I don't really care. And actually, there is another racing game on here I played more, and that'll probably stun a lot of people. Actually, all the racing games I guess I've enjoyed in my life are things that are generally not all that well regarded. I don't know why that is. terms of Virtual Fighter 2, obviously, as you've probably gathered by now, this was something that I was very much looking forward to. Being a kid, I didn't realize that polygon counts and things like that aren't that important. The gaming magazines were talking about them, I was reading those, and I wanted to be up with the times and all that. So I was all about polygon count and other things I didn't really understand that well. And so Virtual Fighter 2 is the ultimate expression of that, or at least it was at the time it came out. Now, by the time I got my copy, a lot of people thought Tekken 2 might be a bit better. Personally, I've gotten Tekken 2 in the years since, and I actually think Virtual Fighter 2 looks a hell of a lot better than Tekken 2. But it doesn't really matter. Virtual Fighter 2 is a fun game. It's well designed. Actually, let me back up. It's well designed. It's a well-made game, not just a good-looking game. And the characters and levels are decent. But what I found is that, much to my surprise, I liked Fighting Vipers a lot better. I got into it more easily. The pace of it, the feel of it, the aesthetic. It was just more my speed than Virtual Fighter 2. And, I mean, Virtual Fighter 2 is definitely an improvement on the original Virtual Fighter, but it just wasn't quite my cup of tea. And again, this was at a time when my interest in fighting games was starting to wane a bit. But, I still was excited to play it, and I had a decent enough time, but I guess based on how ridiculously high my expectations were, I was let down to some extent. I'll give Virtual Fighter 2 a B. And that's, yeah, I think a B is fair based on my experience with it. It's something that I still am willing to play. Like when I play the Yakuza games and they have arcades, if there's a Virtual Fighter 2 machine, I'll play it. Still a fine game. That being said, I really wish Sega would push some of its other Virtual Fighter titles, which I think are just about as good. The original Virtual Fighter, for instance, I've acquired in the years since. Decent enough game. And I've also played the remix, which just has improved graphics, and I really like that one. So I don't know. I don't know why they don't push those things on modern platforms as things you can download for 10 or 15 bucks. I think they would make money doing that, but hell, what do I know? I'm not a business genius like Sega clearly is. Okay. And finally, the last game of that 3-pack was Virtua Cop. This was a light gun shooter, and it was 2 players, so this was one of the best couch co-op games I've ever had. This is also the game this and its sequel are the games I've spent the most time playing with my dad. So my dad, back in the 16-bit era, was willing to occasionally play a bit of Streets of Rage or Golden Axe, maybe a bit of Two Crude Dudes, but that was about it. He wasn't a big gamer. But when it came to Virtua Cop, if I asked him to play that, he pretty much was always going to be there. And I forget when I got my Saturn stun gun. I think it might have come with Virtua Cop 2, so that would have been a little after I got this 3-pack. And in fact, I enjoyed the original Virtua Cop so much that I added Virtua Cop 2 to my Christmas wish list. So I'd gotten this while out Christmas shopping, probably in early December or something, and I'm like, yeah, I need the sequel to this game. This game's awesome. For me, Virtua Cop is still one of my favorites, and it's another game kind of like with Panzer Dragoon, that if you ask me to show you a game that exemplifies what the Saturn's about, I'd pull out Virtua Cop 1 and 2. These games have the Sega styling. So, for instance, Virtua Cop, you have a lot of Sega's sense of humor. The company that you fight at the end of the game in the last level is called the EVL Corporation. Little on the nose, but that's what Sega does. That Nintendo don't. Controls are good. Level design is good. Pacing's good. I enjoyed it very much, and I have not really seen the arcade of Virtua Cop, so I don't know exactly how good of a port it was or wasn't. But I really enjoyed that game, and it was something that I played a hell of a lot. And when I do fire up my Saturn these days, it's usually still to play Virtua Cop. So for me, it's an S tier. And not to spoil things, but the sequel is a better version of Virtua Cop. It also has the 3-level structure. It's compatible with the light gun. There are some improvements, so it looks a little better, plays a little faster. The only downgrade potentially is I feel like the music in the first one's a bit better. But aside from that, Virtual Cop 2 is an improvement across the board. You also have a few branching paths here and there, so that's nice, and there are a couple of additional weapons. There's also some sort of mode where you can go in and make it to where you can always pick your weapon every time you regenerate. And I'm not sure how to do that. My dad figured out how to do it back in the day and always did it when we played. But to this day, I've not figured out how to do that. And a lot of the sites I look at when I try to find the code also don't know about this. So my dad, who was a very casual gamer, knew something that most Saturn fans did not. Anyway, Virtual Cop 2, it's got to be an S tier. And that's in part, again, because I have these very fond memories of playing with my dad. But also, it's a game that really holds up and that I still very much enjoy playing even today in 2023. The third and final light gun game that I had back then was Area 51. And of course, the main reason I got it is because I realized it was light gun compatible. And it looked pretty cool. Again, I really liked Aliens. This was back when I was really in Independence Day, so Area 51 was something that was obviously going to attract my interest. Maximum Force, not as much, because I didn't know about it. And of course, Revolution X, I was aware that game sucked. And I think I had the Genesis version of Rev X that I got really cheap. And yeah, it didn't really make me interested to go out and get the Saturn version. Anyway, Area 51 was an arcade hit. You go to the aforementioned Area 51, you shoot a bunch of aliens, and I guess rescue scientists or whatever it is. It's not a terrible game, but it just doesn't stack up against Virtual Cop. To me, it felt like if you took Virtual Cop and mixed it with something horrible like, what was that game? Corpse Killer, which was a full motion video light gun shooter. And also, by the way, I do have the Graveyard edition of that, which is the Saturn souped up version. But Corpse Killer is more or less really a 3DO or Sega CD game, and the Saturn version doesn't actually improve that much from the Sega CD 32X version, which I also, for some reason, own. Anyway, Area 51 for me is a game that I thought was cool, but I never really got into. So for me, it's kind of like NBA Jam. I'll give it a C. Next up, we have Impact Racing. Now again, I'm not a big fan of racing games as a general rule, but Impact Racing had an additional element that appealed to me, and that is vehicular combat. So I missed out on Road Rash back in the day. Like I said, I was a big Genesis fan, but I didn't play everything. And so Road Rash is something that I never got to play until fairly recently. Well, not recently, but maybe like 2010 or so was the first time I'd really sat down and played Road Rash. So Impact Racing, because you can equip your cars with weapons and shoot at people, for me, made racing playable. So again, I'm not that good at racing games, but if I can gun down my opponents a little bit, then I can kind of make up for that and hopefully place. It's not the best game in the world, but it is some good, dumb fun, and I have no real complaints about it. It's pretty cool. It's not something that I'm eager to whip out today. I've never looked for, say, the PlayStation version of this. It was good for what it was worth, and it's not necessarily worth revisiting, but I'm not regretful of the time I spent playing it. I'll be generous. I'm going to give it a B, actually. It wasn't that bad. It's probably the weakest B, but still, I think it's a little bit underrated. Next up, we have NBA Action 98. I have always been a big fan of basketball sims. I've not been as into arcade-style basketball games like NBA Jam. Now, I did have them, but I was not as interested. And part of the reason I collected the NBA Jam games, at least the ones that I actually asked for, was because if I had company over, I knew that kids would play them. But if I was going to play basketball, it usually was going to be a more realistic experience, the 5-on-5 actual NBA games. The first game I had like that was Live 96 for the Sega Genesis. I played quite a bit of it. And then the first kind of next-gen experience I had was NBA Action 98, which, as you can see, or maybe you can't see, has Kobe Bryant on the cover. So this is back when Kobe was a rising star. This, I believe, was his second season. And this is a game that, even at the time, I knew was hokey. Chick Hearn was the announcer, and he'd say things like, "Dribble drive! He scores it!" And then the other problem is that the quarters are usually about 12 minutes. These games can be very long. There aren't that many sim options, so you can't really, say, customize the league or anything like that. That being said, the basic gameplay is actually pretty good. And I have played it in recent years expecting to go back and find a real cringe fest. And actually, despite the weird announcing, it's a good game. And it surprisingly holds up. I prefer this to the Saturn versions of NBA Live that I now have. I'm pretty sure I have Live 97 on Saturn. And I have 98, 99, 2000 on PlayStation. And actually, I kind of prefer the feel of this game to most of those. The problem with the live games is that while they're really fun, they're a little too fast. At least the, say, Live 2000, which I played the crap out of back in the day. But part of the reason I was really into Live is because you can, there are more modes, and also I had a functioning PlayStation memory stick, and saving games on Saturn is not something I was ever able to do. Anyway, Action is a good game, and while it was more usual for me to go back and play childhood games and realize that they're not quite as good as I thought. But in the case of NBA Action, it actually was a little better than I remember it. So much respect there. Next up, we have Fighters Megamix. So, toward the end of the Saturn's life, about the same time that Last Bronx came out, Sega decided to effectively combine Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers into one game. And then they added a few Sega characters, such as the two cops from Virtua Cop, or maybe three of them. I think there was one male and a female named Janet. And they also added the car from Daytona, USA, and this new game that kind of blended together Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers was called Fighters Megamix. For most Saturn fans, this was the best game on Saturn in terms of fighting games. I also liked it, and I liked that there were unlockables. It was kind of a big game, similar to, say, Tekken 3. We've got lots of unlockables and stuff going on. So things like Soul Blade, the PlayStation port of Soul Edge, and then Tekken 3, which were two games I played a lot of on PlayStation. They had lots of modes like this, and things were great. So Fighters Megamix was comparable to those, and it came out around the same time, so that makes sense. But I actually found it had a little less charm than Fighting Vipers or Virtua Fighter 2 by themselves. So the characters went together well enough, and the basic engine was similar enough in any case that the fighters could fight each other. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine Lau taking on Raxel, but it's just something was lost. I don't know exactly how to explain it. For me, it wasn't quite as good. Now, I did play it and had a decent enough time, but this is just not one I would ever come back to, I don't think. It just doesn't have quite the same appeal anymore. If I'm going to play a fighting game, I want something that's kind of short, sweet, to the point, and also has a steady aesthetic, a reliable feel to it, and frankly, Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers provide that better on their own than Fighters Megamix does. If I were rating it, this is probably a hot take, but it's going in the C category. At the time, if you'd asked me back in the day, I'd probably put this in A. But it's one, when I've revisited it, I really find that it doesn't do it for me anymore. So kind of the reverse of what I experienced with NBA Action 98. Another fighting game that I had was Virtual On. which is about giant robots, and it's a one-on-one fighting game with lots of missiles and projectiles. So it's kind of a mix, if you will, of a traditional fighting game with, say, Mech Warrior. Cool idea, Fast and Furious action. I had a good time with it, but it wasn't necessarily the best fighting game I'd ever played. And I remember my sessions with it were usually relatively short. I don't know if I ever played this for more than about 30 to 45 minutes at a time before I'd be tired of it. That being said, I always thought it was really cool, but it really wasn't that great. And I also have found that while there were critiques in the magazines at the time of the port, cutting back on assets or whatever, I played the arcade version since, and I find that it's not that different. So it's actually a pretty good port. It's just that the core game is a little limited. It's very much flashy rather than substantive. And unfortunately, that's a critique I could level at the Saturn as a whole, at least the games I had that were mostly arcade ports, as you see here. Virtual On for me is a C. Next up, we have Soviet Strike. So I did not quite get into the Strike series on Genesis and Super Nintendo until later. The first one I played was actually after I'd played Soviet Strike, and that's because I found a reprint of Urban Strike on Super Nintendo, super cheap, during my time as a PlayStation gamer, probably around 1999 or so. Anyway, my first exposure to the Strike series is actually Soviet Strike on Saturn. And once again, you fly around as mostly an Apache, and I believe you're fighting Soviets or post-Soviets. And once again, the premise is that you, by yourself, as one helicopter, are going to take down a whole army. You sometimes have to be a bit secretive. There are various mission objectives. There's also some FMV scenes, full motion video, where you get briefed or people come in over the screen to talk to you. Technically, this was a good-looking game for the time. I believe it came out in 1996. And I've since learned, because I acquired the PlayStation version years later, that the Saturn version is actually a fair amount better in terms of the graphics and also the gameplay. I feel like the Strike series always ran best on Sega systems. And in this case, it doesn't make as much sense because, as a general rule, PlayStation was supposed to be better at 3D games. Well, actually, is this 3D? I don't actually know if this game would count as 3D or not. I guess it depends on how technical you want to get. Anyway, this is another game that was hard as balls, and I didn't have an ability to save, so I mostly floundered around in the first level. It was a quality game, it's just not one necessarily that I was able to get deep into. For me, Soviet Strike is a B. I respect this game, and it's one, I swear one day I will get into the Strike series and really actually beat these things. And I guess I'll have to do it with the PlayStation version simply because I can save the games. And also, of course, PlayStation has Nuclear Strike, which is the sequel that Saturn didn't get. Finally, we get to Warcraft 2. So, this was around the same time, as I mentioned, my gaming tastes were changing as I crossed into double-digit age. I was moving away from fighting games. I was still big into beat-em-ups, which were being de-emphasized at the time because of changes. So I was mostly still playing things like Streets of Rage or Turtles in Time. And I was starting to get into strategy games. And to this day, strategy games are my favorite. Now, I often play things like RPGs or shooters instead, just because of availability. But strategy games are the things that really hook me. So I have to be careful about when I play strategy games because I could get deep into it, and next thing I know, it's 7 in the morning. And that really started with Command & Conquer Red Alert on PC. And then I wasn't into fantasy. I've actually never been a big fantasy person to this day. But especially back then, I was not into fantasy. And this is before I got into history as well, actually. So I know it's probably difficult to imagine, but at one point, Thersites the Historian would have been more like Thersites the Sega gamer. So I was not in the history at all when I was a Saturn gamer. That really started right around the time I got my PlayStation. But Warcraft 2 is something I played at a friend's house after I'd already discovered my affection for Red Alert. And so Warcraft 2, when I found out there was a Saturn version, that was something that I wanted. So I think this was one of the very last games I picked up for the console, and it has gone on to be one of my favorites. Now, granted, the load times for this are very long, but it's an excellent port of the game. And rather than having to compete with my sisters and my parents for PC time, especially when I couldn't stay up past a certain time because I was in school and I had to go to bed, I could instead just pop it in my Saturn and play at my leisure in my own room. And also, this is back in the day when you had to actually adjust settings on a PC to run a game, and every time I'd try to play anything, my mom would be freaked out that I might fuck up the settings and make it hard for her to check email or something. So I generally strayed away from PC gaming. And actually, this is probably the reason to this day why I've never really gotten into PC gaming. But I digress. Warcraft 2 for me actually has become a sacred cow as a Saturn game. And I only realized that when I was talking with one of my friends about my Saturn collection. He's looking through, and he said, "Oh, well, this is just some crappy Warcraft 2 port." Because he assumed that because it's a console port, it must be crappy. But this one actually looks and sounds great. It doesn't have a lot of slowdown once you get into the games. I've made relatively deep runs with both the Human Alliance and the Orcs, using the password system. This is a fine game. And actually, I like it so much that I spent a pretty penny getting the PlayStation version as well. Because I always have a PS3 plugged up that can run old PS1 games. Anyway, for me, Warcraft 2 Tides of Time, it includes both the original game and all the expansions. Orcs and humans are all on the same disc. Excellent value. For me, this is an S-tier game. And I know that's probably an unexpected take, but Warcraft 2 on Saturn is a hell of an experience. And I don't give a shit what anybody says. Also, I have a version of Command & Conquer now as well. I forgot to mention that. So, my first Command & Conquer, the original experience, was on Saturn. I rented at Blockbuster the first Command & Conquer. But I ended up getting the PlayStation version because it was much easier to find. And again, there's the whole saving games problem. So yeah, I've always had Command & Conquer on PlayStation. And I now also own Command & Conquer for the Sega Saturn. And finally, we have Resident Evil. This is the last game I remember getting as a kid on Saturn. I'm pretty sure after this point, I didn't receive any more Saturn games until I was an adult and I could find these things for myself at used game stores. Resident Evil for Saturn came out a year after the PlayStation version, and about the same time that Resident Evil 2 came out for the PlayStation. It has a special battle mode. There are a few changes from the PlayStation edition. It's a fine game. That being said, a lot of people at the time noted that PlayStation already had 2 versions of this game. Actually, probably 3, because there's original Director's Cut, then Director's Cut Dual Shock. And Saturn is just now getting 1. And then PlayStation's about to get the sequel, which really amped things up to the 9s. It was around the time I received this game that it finally was getting through to me that PlayStation was the way to go, and that all the cool shit was going to be on PlayStation. So I got this game, I played it, I thought it was incredible, and then I realized every experience that's going to be like this is going to be over on PlayStation from now on, so I better make the transition. And so I did. In terms of what I experienced with Resident Evil on Saturn, I didn't know how to solve most of the puzzles because I was still maybe, 11 years old by the time I got this. And so I didn't really know how to play it well enough, but I still made it deep enough to experience the game and understand the mechanics. I I don't scare super easily, and that was even true when I was a kid, so I don't think I really found the game scary except for that one infamous scene where the dog jumps through the window, the big jump scare. That being said, I did find this one to be cool, and it inspired me to get PlayStation and pick up, again, Director's Cut. I think to this day I still have Director's Cut with DualShock, and I have RE2 and 3. And actually, I've gotten more into Resident Evil in the last couple of years, so I actually have a backlog now. I played Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2 for Xbox recently. Because of my difficulty with saving, I've never been able to play this game in terms of doing a deep run. So I guess if I was ever going to do that, it would require me to get an emulator or to get a different console. That being said, Resident Evil for Saturn is a fine game, and one of the best on the console. And maybe that's a damning indictment, since, again, this was a year after the PlayStation already had it, and the PlayStation got multiple versions. And then Saturn got a good version, but again, it wasn't the latest and greatest cutting-edge thing when it got it. That being said, the game's still an A as far as I'm concerned. And I still think of this version quite fondly. I really wish I had a way to play this all the way through. So again, if you want to make me happy for my birthday coming up on the 31st, hook me up with Saturn emulator. Tell me how to do it, or whatever, however the fuck you set it up. I don't know, I'm tired. I guess I'm not going to get around to talking about Lucius Vedius tonight. So what I was working on earlier, well, actually I got two of these. This is before I went on vacation. I've already recorded the first slide with my intro, and now I got to go back and do all the details. And I also have Lucius Vedius, the Jeffrey Epstein of the Roman Republic, and I'm really excited to get into that one. It's just that I am clearly not in rhythm tonight. This is actually the second attempt I've made to do this video. I was discussing Robotica last time, and I realized I was dragging ass and not performing very well, and so I just stopped myself and started over. Anyway, I didn't do that great this time either, but this is the Who the Fuck Gives a Shit podcast, so who the fuck gives a shit? I was talking about Saturn games. It's not a big deal. If I was less than perfect on this, I can live with that, and so can you, because it isn't really all that important at the end of the day. Anyway, that's all I have for you now. That's the end of episode 9. I will probably make another episode in the future. I don't know what I'll make it on, though. So I'm guessing I'll probably do it on my Super Nintendo childhood collection, because I have one of those list up. So I'll probably do that. That should be pretty easy. So anyway, until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, or, well, the host and only performer on WTFGAS podcast, and that is it for me this evening. So good night, good luck, and I will see you around on my other channel with hopefully much better content. Peace out.